want to thank the Schwartzes, Bernard and Denise Schwartz, because they have underwritten this program. And I thank you. And this is all in the honor of Richard Extract.
Well, thank you. It's really fun, and it's an honor to be here. And what Dale didn't mention is that Richard Extract is an alum of our college. So we're really proud of him and really pleased to be here. So we're going to be talking, and I should also mention, as I will later, that Julie K. Brown is an alumna of our college as well. So you're all Temple Owls here today. We're here to talk about investigative reporting, and I'm going to start off just sort of setting the stage for why investigative journalism is so important, and it's never been more threatened than it is today. With the decline of journalism, with the decline of resources put towards serious reporting, and especially on the local news front. Many of you were at an event for the Coderre Institute last night where we spoke about the threats to local journalism and an effort that Richard and Eileen are putting together to try to strengthen credibility around local journalism. And the story you're going to hear about more today was, of course, a local news investigation that Julie did for the Miami Herald. And I'm also going to tell you briefly about some investigative work that I was involved in so that you can really start to think about this on a local level. We tend to think about investigative reporting more on a national, international level, but it is every bit as important and maybe even more important for our democracy to have it on a local level. Before I get started, I want to say just a little bit more about Temple University and the Klein College, who we are. Temple is known in the Northeast as Philadelphia's public university. There obviously are great universities in and around Philadelphia. I know there are quite a few Wharton grads in this room, but we are the only public university in Philadelphia. It's a large university, about 40,000 students. It was founded in the 1880s by somebody who said, higher education should be available to everybody and they should have access to excellence. At the time, the people in North Philadelphia were primarily, Russian and Jewish and Polish immigrants, Italians, Irish, some Puerto Ricans, and the descendants of slaves. Today, it's almost exclusively Black and Latino, and we are still serving those people and bringing them college education. We have 17 schools and colleges, including a very fine law school, medical school, and the Klein College of Media and Communication. It's one of the largest and most innovative schools of its kind in the country. We have about 3,000 students. We have about 80 full-time faculty and 150 part-time faculty. The faculty are divided, and this is something that's really special and unique among universities. Most universities tend to lean either towards straight practitioners who take more of a vocational approach, or scholars who take more of a research academic approach. We try to balance both. We try to give the students that good theoretical background, but then there are a lot of people like myself who came right from the business who are teaching them as well. Just this week, we were named the top college television station in the country, and we recently won the top award for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we have, just in the past couple of years, created academic centers around urban investigative reporting, sports media, and media literacy, and now we're hoping to start this new center that would be named for our fine alum, Richard, and the Extract Center for News Credibility would be the first academic center in the country that addressed the challenges of misinformation and disinformation in local news. So most of you heard about that last night. So now let's talk about investigative reporting and why it matters and why efforts like this are so important to keep journalism vital and vibrant and alive for American democracy. I'll wait for her to get away from the screen. There we go. So why should we do investigative reporting? It's, first of all, it's one of our most profound responsibilities as the press. I mean, we are the only industry, the singular industry that is called out in the United States Constitution, freedom of the press. And They knew what they were doing. They knew that any healthy, thriving democracy needed to have a healthy and thriving and vibrant and vital press. It really is a privilege under the First Amendment. Speaking of privileges, I've had the opportunity to do training of journalists in 52 different countries around the world. And they literally are dying to have the freedom that we have as journalists to do investigative reporting. Just south of our own border, they're dying because they don't have the freedom and power to do investigative reporting. So I always try to impose on American reporters that you really have a responsibility to exercise the rights that we have. It is good business. Study after study have shown that good investigative journalism sells newspapers, brings traffic to news websites, gets television ratings. I'm always baffled by why news companies don't do more of it. The best investigations, the ones that were like the ones we're here to talk about today, they really start at the street level. It's not just pontificating. It's really doing the hard work at the street level, bringing questions, beginning with questions, rather than with hypotheses and then finding the answers. They have to be clearly relevant to people to engage them. And most importantly, they have to tell citizens something that people in power don't want them to know. And ultimately, the best have an impact. What do they require? They require sorting the priorities. In this day and age, there are so few resources in newsrooms. It takes a special sort of leader to say, all right, we're going to dedicate a lot of those resources to doing investigative reporting. It takes today skills in the use of data, in documents, and in interviewing. It means having personal and institutional courage, and certainly the story you're going to hear about from the Miami Herald exercised both of those, because the threats of legal action, the canceling that goes on social media, it really takes a special sort of courage to do this sort of reporting. And then ultimately, and this may be the answer to my own question of why don't they do more of it, it really takes a lot of time and money. As you'll hear when Julie talks about her story, you really have to invest a lot of time to do meaningful investigative journalism. So I'm going to talk just really briefly about a few examples from my own experience. These are stories that I worked on either as a reporter or an editor, and I think demonstrate those qualities that I talked about. And sometimes they come off of hard news stories. They aren't always something that you set out to see as an investigative story. So one would be off the Exxon Valdez oil spill, which when I talk to students about it, they have no idea what it is. But judging by the hair colors in this room, I'm going to guess you know what this was. 1989, the largest environmental disaster in American history. Literally hundreds, maybe even thousands of reporters went to Alaska to cover this event. As you might recall, there was a ship's captain. He actually was from Long Island, and he was intoxicated. It turns out he was an alcoholic. He had gone down below in this giant oil tanker and left the control of the ship to a novice who was trying to navigate between these massive rocks in Prince William Sound. Well, that guy drove the ship right into a big reef. There was a massive oil spill of 11 million gallons, had profound impact on the economy of Alaska and on the fishing industry. That story was very important to us in Seattle because, as it turns out, the Alaskan fishing industry is headquartered in Seattle. Most of those people live in Seattle most of the year, go up to Alaska during fishing season. So we looked at that, but we began with a question, which was, how could one drunken sailor cause the biggest environmental disaster in American history? From that, we learned many key things, but probably the most important was that the United States, unlike almost every other developed country in the world, allowed these ships to have single hulls. These big oil tankers had single hulls. The ratio of the body of the ship to the oil that it carried would be the same as you carrying water in a gallon Ziploc bag. And there was very little protection. In Europe and in Asia and many developed countries, they had double hulls so that if it hit a rock, the water flowed into an empty space and the oil stayed in place. So this story helped change the rules. Double hulls are now required in the United States directly as a result of this story, which won the Pulitzer Prize that year. This, I believe, was the very first Me Too story in America. You know, we think of this as a modern phenomenon, but we actually did a story back in 1992 in which we revealed a United States senator named Brock Adams. He was a liberal senator from Washington. He had been the Secretary of Transportation under Jimmy Carter. He was renowned as a champion of women's rights, and he was accused by a 23-year-old congressional aide of having drugged and raped her. Over the course of the next 2.5 years, we worked on this story. 2.5 years it took us to finally get 8 more women, or 7 additional women who were, 8 more women who were willing to come out and tell their stories of having been abused and in some cases raped by this U.S. senator. He denied the story immediately, but he stepped out of the race for re-election. And as it turns out, this story really helped change the national dialogue around sexual misconduct by people in power. This one affects probably every single one of you. This was back in the late 1990s, early 2000s. There were major safety issues in the Boeing 737. And this is not the recent MAX problems, although there are echoes of this in those problems. Boeing had a major design flaw in the tail mechanism of a 737, the most used airplane in the world. These planes were going down mysteriously all over the world, and Boeing continually was blaming it on pilot error. In many cases, they were saying the pilots were on suicide missions, and they were denying any sort of involvement, any sort of accountability in these accidents. Our aviation reporter was very well sourced with pilots and mechanics, and over the course of many months was able to put together patterns of what had happened in every one of these accidents and establish this design flaw in the tail rudder. Ultimately, Boeing, along the way, tried to get the reporter taken off the story, threatened us not only with lawsuits, but with boycotts of its employees. It was the largest employer in the city of Seattle and environment, and they threatened to engage all of their employees in a boycott of the Seattle Times. But we published the story, and the very next morning, they announced that they were pulling these airplanes back for safety modifications. That won the Pulitzer Prize as well. This story began just with a tip. This was also in the late 90s. It began with a tip that there was a big house, extraordinarily large house for the region of 5,300 square feet being built on an Indian reservation where people were literally living in cardboard boxes and tents and rusty little trailers. But this big house was being built in the middle of the reservation. So we got up in a helicopter and took a picture of it and started digging. It's very difficult to get information out of Indian tribes because they have sovereignty. These are not public records. But over time and the development of sources, we were able to establish that the owners of this house were 2 tribal officials whose job it was to process the federal aid that came into the tribe to improve housing. And because they had sovereignty, they were able to do whatever they wanted to do with the money. So the federal government was already paying these people $93,000 a year to have this responsibility, but then they were sending hundreds of thousands of dollars to the tribe to improve housing, and these people just used it to build themselves a house. So we thought, wow, if this is happening here, it must be happening in other places. We started looking around the Northwest. We found a case in Oregon where a former NFL player who was 1/16th Native American, 1/16th, discovered this scam. He became the tribal official for the housing money, and he used it to build himself a private business. So we found ultimately 26 cases like this around the country in 26 different states. And this led to major reforms in the program and also won the Pulitzer Prize. And this one is more recent, and this was in 2012. We discovered, again, starting small at the street level, just with some tips, we discovered that the state of Washington, in a very well-intended effort to get people off of addiction to oxycodone and other of these really high-powered pain pills, was putting them on to methadone as an alternative treatment. What the state hadn't realized, and we discovered by building a big database, is they had killed more than 2,000 people with this drug, and that it was almost equally deadly to what these people were already on. So immediately the state stopped using that, doctors stopped prescribing it, other states followed, and this also won the Pulitzer Prize. Speaking of Pulitzer, I love this quote: "There's not a crime, there's not a vice which does not live in secrecy. Get these things out in the open, describe them, attack them, ridicule them in the press, and sooner or later public opinion will sweep them away." And that's what this is certainly all about. So with that, I'm going to introduce our, and I like to say your, superstar investigative reporter from your Miami Herald, and a story that is right here in your backyard. I understand from last night many of you know many of the players involved, and we are fortunate enough also to have the police chief at the time, so we'll probably hear from him as well. Julie is one of our finest alumna at the Klein College of Media and Communication. She's got an amazing personal story that she may share a little with you. I love to tell it because she grew up in a really a family where it wasn't the expectation that you would go to college. In fact, quite contrary. She was working in a lampshade factory, and somebody said, "Julie, you're pretty smart. You should go to college." She said, I can't go to college. Well, I don't have any money. And somehow she was able to piece together scholarship money from Temple, made it through her journalism degree, and has gone on to this amazing career. Because of that, we recently awarded her our top alumni award, which we are very proud to do. She won many national awards for her work on the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, and then she is the author of a fantastic book on the whole case, which is available to you out in the lobby with her signature. So with that, I should also add, this year she is a professional in residence at our school. I'm very proud to have her here. So with that, introduce Julie K. Brown.
Hi there. Thank you for having me. Thank you all for supporting the work that Klein College is doing. David talked a little bit about my background. I'm just going to elaborate a little bit more. I left a home at the age of 16. My mother was struggling and really couldn't afford to support 3 children all by herself, so I went out on my own at 16, got a job. As David mentioned, I worked a number of odd jobs, delivering flowers, working at a lampshade factory, working as a secretary, just doing a bunch of jobs until I finally realized that if I didn't go to college, I would probably end up working at Walmart the rest of my life. I went to Temple University and said, "What can you do to help me get to school?" And they essentially gave me all the money that I needed to go to school. And I get really emotional when I talk about this because it really did change my life. I'm forever grateful for them for doing that. I'm sorry. It always makes me emotional when I think about it because, as I said, I left home at 16, so I would have never been standing here if it wasn't for Temple supporting me. So I worked really hard, as they say, I paid my dues. My first job was working for a little tiny newspaper in Hunterdon County, New Jersey, and I wrote obituaries. And I'd like to say I wrote the best obituaries that any reporter had ever written because I thought of them like little stories about people. I didn't think about them like they were obituaries. I thought about them as little profiles about people and what they did in their lives. And, it also taught me a lot about interviewing people, because if you can interview someone who lost a loved one and have the patience and just the ability to talk to them in their worst time, it's very good training for a journalist to learn how to talk to people. And as I said, I just worked my way up until I got a job in Philadelphia at the Philadelphia Daily News, started covering police, and graduated into the point that I wanted to really look at other problems in the city and why they were happening. And I did a story about firefighters in Philadelphia who were dying in record numbers, and it turned out that they had been infected by hepatitis C, and the city wasn't paying their benefits because they kept saying that the reason why the firefighters had hepatitis C was because they were drinkers. They were all alcoholics, which was absurd. And sure enough, after doing a lot of research, we learned that the reason why they were dying was, in fact, because they were coming in contact with blood. They were also paramedics, and this was a time before paramedics were wearing plastic gloves. So they were, they were literally in blood all the time. So as a result of that, the state legislature passed laws requiring that the cities and the counties in Pennsylvania continue the benefits for employees, not only firefighters, paramedics, but also nurses and other public health workers who had been exposed and had contracted hepatitis C. So I, fast forward to, I got a job. I decided to come down to South Florida and work for the Miami Herald. I had done a number of stories about the prison system here, and the suspicious deaths of inmates here, and had discovered that there was there was a lot of corruption in the Florida prison system here. And as a result of abuse by prison guards, a lot of these inmates were being killed, essentially, in the prison system. And, what I like to tell people, the reason why I say all this is because everything that I did in my career led me to the point where I was able to do a story like Jeffrey Epstein. No reporter can come out and just do a story like that from the get-go. Every bit of training, every person I interviewed, every story I did taught me more skills and gave me more training to be able to do such an enormous story, which the Jeffrey Epstein was a really huge story to undertake. There were probably 10,000 different records that had to be mined for information. And there were victims, there were public officials who had never been spoken to before. It was just a huge case. And one of the lawyers who was involved in the case would later say, that he was asked at a press conference, well, why is this story becoming big now? Why did this come out now? Because this was a pretty dated story by the time I reopened it. It had been around for about 10 years. And the lawyer said, well, there were reporters over the years that came to us and said they wanted to do a story. And we told them, here's the files, and there were tens of thousands of records. And we said to them, because we didn't want to waste our time explaining everything to them, come back to us when you read all these files. Come back to us when you talk to this person, that person, another person. And he said, nobody ever did that except for Julie Brown. I was the only reporter that actually did the work. And that's what investigative reporting is. I don't think we in journalism do a good job sometimes of telling people what we do and how we do it, because we kind of do it, automatically. We don't always think about how do we do it. But because I've had to talk about this case so many times, I've had to really go over in my head, like exactly how did we do this, And I have to also mention that I had a partner in this journey, Emily Michaud, who was my videographer, photographer, just the person that held my hand when I felt like I was going to fall apart, because it was such a strenuous and stressful project. And she kind of helped me not only document it and do interviews with a lot of these young women who, by the way, had not spoken about what had happened to them in some cases in a decade. In many cases, these young women had never told anybody that what had happened to them. They kept it secret inside of them their whole, until they were young adults, until they spoke with us. So you're resurrecting something that caused a lot of trauma to a lot of young women, girls really, when this happened. And that was also part of the challenge, being patient and trying to tell their story in the most respectful way possible. And no one was more surprised probably than I was the day that they arrested Jeffrey Epstein. I knew it was a very important story. I knew we did a great job. But to be honest with you, because of all the powerful people involved, I never thought that they would arrest him again. He had gotten away with it before. I know for a fact he thought he would get away with it again. I tried to talk to him several times. I sent certified letters to his lawyers. We sent certified letters to every single person that was mentioned in the story who was connected to him. And I think Alan Dershowitz was the only one who responded. And as you can imagine, he responded. So he obviously didn't think that much was going to happen. I think he probably thought, this is just another little reporter from the Miami Herald who's writing another little story about me, and nothing's going to happen. The story did get a big lift because, number one, that same year, I started the project before Harvey Weinstein happened, but in the course of me putting together this series, of course, the Harvey Weinstein case happened. So that helped a little bit, I think, give us attention for it. And then beyond that, it really did go viral on social media. I think a lot of people knew about this case, and they always had the same questions that we did. How does someone like that abuse that many girls and essentially get away with it? How does that happen? And that's what we really set out to try to find out when we did this story. And so that's it. Most people always ask the question that really what made me decide to open this case after all these years. And basically it was a timing right around the time that I started looking at the case. Ironically, President Trump nominated a guy by the name of Alex Acosta to be his labor secretary. And I was keenly aware that he was the prosecutor who signed off on Jeffrey Epstein's sweetheart deal. And at that time I thought, well, it's going to come out again, people are going to write about it again, and he probably won't be confirmed. But to my surprise, hardly anybody asked him questions about it. The one or two questions that he got, he was very evasive in what they asked him. And so I thought now would be a good time to take a look at this all over again. And I started doing the public records request, and it goes on and on and on, the steps that a reporter has to take, because the most important thing with a case like this is you don't want to make a mistake. There's, as I mentioned, there are some very litigious people, some very powerful people connected with this story, and we knew that if we had made one mistake, that it would have hurt probably the entire project. So it had to be airtight. We had our own set of lawyers with the Miami Herald who helped us lawyer the story, and my editor, Casey Frank, the investigations editor for the Miami Herald, helped us put together not only the series itself, but we had several documentaries that went with it, like mini documentaries of the women who spoke on camera for the first time, which was extremely powerful. And I think that that probably had as much to do with the reaction to the story as anything else, because this was the first time these victims were talking publicly about not only the abuse, but what was almost just as horrifying was how they were treated by the criminal justice system. And how they were discarded, and how their stories were not to be believed, and how, quite frankly, the prosecutor here in Palm Beach at the time, who I'm sure some of you know, just decided that he was going to essentially let this case go because he felt that the girls had allowed this to happen even though they were 14, 15 years old. And thankfully, I had the support of the former police chief at the time, who had never really spoken to a reporter publicly before. He didn't want to talk to me initially. I had to convince him to talk to me, and to talk to me on the record, because I felt it was important that everyone really understand exactly what happened. And it was a cover-up. It really was a cover-up. And it stayed covered up for quite a long time. So Michael Ryder is here. He kindly agreed to come and visit us, and I'm so happy to see him because he updated me on everything that's happened. Just today, they had oral arguments in a case that the Palm Beach Post is pursuing to finally unseal the grand jury documents in the Epstein case. These were the county portion of the case, where they decided to take it to the grand jury to decide whether to charge Jeffrey Epstein with crimes. And essentially what happened was they brought it to a grand jury. They only brought one victim that we know of anyway to testify. And I can say, because it's in court documents, that later the federal investigators suggested or implied that probably what happened was the county officials here sabotaged the grand jury so that they would not come up with a criminal indictment of Jeffrey Epstein. But we don't know for sure because these records have been secret all these years. So the Palm Beach Post is now suing to unseal those records and those oral arguments before the appeals court. And a lower court already ruled not to unseal them. And now an appeals court heard those arguments this morning. So hopefully we'll get a decision on that soon. So that's for you.
Why don't we have the chief come up and speak a little bit with you?
Yeah.
I'd like to hear you both talk about reporter-police relationships and just how you came to be convinced to talk to a reporter.
Well, thank you. By the way, we've never done this before. We've had national media outlets and huge organizations asked us to do this.
Yeah.
I guess there is no free lunch. I was invited to this last night, and now I know how I have to pay for this. So I came to the town of Palm Beach. It was a great stroke of luck at age 22, and I worked for 20 years on the Palm Beach Police Department, became the chief. I was chief for 8 years, and about 2 or 3 years into my being chief, a victim walked into the Palm Beach Police Department with her parents and reported the very first case that came to the attention of the Palm Beach Police Department of Jeffrey Epstein's crimes. So it is one of the most unusual prosecutions, investigations in modern criminal justice history in America. I'll give you a couple of examples. Could you raise your hand, by the way, if you live in Palm Beach or you've ever lived in Palm Beach, raise your hand so I know who I'm talking to. Okay, some of you I know, of course. The short time into that case, I was surveilled as police chief around the clock by Epstein's lawyers and private investigators. I don't know of that ever happening anywhere else before. I've told other police chiefs that it's a rare occasion, and they tried to talk to my grade school teachers to see if they could find something about me that they could exploit, which they tried to. They tried to say that I was anti-Semitic and that I was a religious nutcase. That was in the national news media that Epstein's people planted. But I remained quiet about it they teach police officers, they teach police chiefs that you don't trust the news media. Give them only what you have to. In Florida, we have a liberal public records law, and when they ask you a question, see if you have a document that answers it and hand it to them and don't say any more. So I always felt like this case needed to be handled in the courts and not in the news media. I remained silent about it, even though I was attacked publicly by the numerous public relations firms hired by Epstein and his lawyers for years. When I retired from the police department, I had all sorts of news media come to me. Many of them I cooperated off the record and told them where to go and what to read and what to do, because the case was improperly prosecuted, corruptly prosecuted. State attorney in Palm Beach County told me to write Jeffrey Epstein a notice to appear the equal of a traffic ticket for all of the victims that had come forward. The U.S. attorney who I called to task told me that he would act responsibly with the case, and he did not. We labeled in the state of Florida these victims as prostitutes. They were children. I had to convince lawyers, unsuccessfully, prosecutors, that a child could not consent to having sex with an adult. And so there were numerous Pulitzer Prize winners, very well-known names that I could give them to you, and you'd recognize them in the investigative journalism world that worked on this case. Every one of them's cases prior to investigations prior to Julian and Miami Herald was stopped. And some of them would tell me what happened. They got called into the editor's office and told that they had other things to do. They got transferred to real estate journalism instead of investigative journalism. And then I met Julie. And Julie said to me, the reason this case has not received the attention that it needed was because I remained silent on it to the news media. And I thought about that, and I knew she baited me a little bit with that. It's probably a technique you teach in the university. But I also thought potentially it was true. And I talked to the lead investigator. He had retired by then as well, and he has since passed. We decided to listen to Julie. We realized she did all of her work. We realized she understood the case, and she knew what was wrong about it. And without Julie doing what she did, I'm sorry to say, I think Epstein would still be alive today doing the same thing. There were 4 or 5 people that all had to do this, and it took courage on all of our parts. If any one of them did not do their job, Joe Ricari, the detective, myself, one of the prosecutors, this would still be going on. And if you're wondering now, how bad is this? A federal appellate court, in their ruling on this entire matter, called the prosecution and handling of this case by the criminal justice system a national disgrace. So, it's not done. There are states that 14-year-olds can be arrested for prostitution. Those states, Florida's not one of them anymore, should change. And I think this case should be taught in law school, legal ethics classes. There are lawyers in the room. I see a few of you. Anybody who's ever considering being a prosecutor needs to know about the slippery slope. It wasn't just me. The last thing I'm going to say, and then we can answer whatever questions you have. The Palm Beach Police Department, I had a really great team. Some of them were surveilled 24 hours a day. And what that means is the private investigators go to our houses and collect our trash and take it and lay it out and look for everything. There are a lot of really nefarious things that happened on the other side of that. I had a 9-hour deposition in a civil case over this. Jeffrey Epstein was sitting across the table from me. And to get you an idea of how vile this person was, and some of you may know him, he tried to hire me at that deposition. So, I'm glad this played out organically, because we've been talking about doing this for a long time, into a small room and some friends in the room. But of all the awards that you received, can never be enough, because you were in jeopardy, and I'm sure you were surveilled as well when all this went on. And the fact of the matter is, if they could have erased you and I from the earth, they would have done that in order to stop this. And it still goes on. I was told yesterday I have a subpoena coming in one of the remaining civil cases, and it's 17 years later.
Thanks.
So with that, we'll take your questions. Let's see, Debbie has a microphone. Or, oh, it's up
This one.
here. Okay, this one. She'll raise your hand and she'll get it to you.
Oh, thanks for starting with me. Wonderful talk. This may be after your time, but did either of you, investigate Epstein's death? Or do you have any thoughts about what happened there?
Well, I have my thoughts on it because I did investigate it to some degree. I know the forensic pathologist that the family, Epstein's brother, hired to really examine it. His name is Dr. Michael Boardman. I had done some cases with him unrelated to the Epstein case in previous years. I have a lot of respect for him. He helped with a lot of my suspicious prison death cases. And he also has a lot of expertise in prison deaths because he was on the New York State Prison Advisory Board. In other words, he was on the board that investigated all the deaths that happened in New York prisons. And he was on that board for 25 years. So he knew better than most people how deaths are sort of staged in prisons. And he is of the firm belief that it absolutely was not a suicide, that it was absolutely a homicide. And there's just too many, as one police officer told me early on in my career, there is no such thing as a coincidence. And in this particular case, you had two guards that essentially fell asleep or were preoccupied. The cameras weren't working. He had he had just been released from suicide watch, but yet he had a sleep apnea machine with all those cords in his cell. The inmate that was his partner that was supposed to be keeping an eye on him was taken out, just hours before it happened and moved to a prison that's for essentially people they want to protect. I mean, it's just too much to. No, I don't know. I mean, your guess would probably be almost as good as mine, yeah, there's a long list. And also, I want to also mention that the coroner in New York that did this, autopsy has never released the records. And I think given the notoriety of this case, and also the questions that it brings to mind about whether we believe our government, I think that those records should have been made public about, why did she come to that conclusion? What, specifically did she see? What specifically did she know? And to this day, that is just one more thing in this case that has been kept, sealed and secret.
Okay, is this live? Hi. Maybe it's misinformation, but very early this morning on Twitter, there was a certain amount of back and forth to the effect that Bill Gates had visited Epstein's island 37 times. Have you seen anything like that?
Well, one of the reasons I think that David Boardman and Richard want to form this foundation and this center at Temple is because of all the misinformation that's out there. And that is certainly misinformation that's out there. And I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, Aaron Rodgers, the quarterback, said something on media about how, this Chinese balloon was up there because it was trying to distract people from the lists that's coming out about Epstein's, people that were involved with Epstein. There's no list that I know of that's about to be released. A lot of information is just conflated on social media, and it just happens, and then it goes round and around and around, and it's like the old game of whisper down the lane. It's not based in fact, and those kinds of things are hurting the media itself, which we really effort to report the truth, and it also just hurts our country, quite frankly.
I have a question. I was surprised that Kenneth Starr was a lead person in this case and perhaps used some of his governmental contacts. I always saw Ken Starr as a pretty straight arrow. He and I were in the second grade together. He lives 2 doors down from me in a little Texas town and then moved away. What was the deal? How did Ken Starr was a pretty straight arrow? Maybe he wasn't. Tell me about it, would you?
Well, Jeffrey Epstein was a master at manipulating people, a master, really. He was a genius at how to kind of bring people in and connect people with him. Some of the most brilliant people, Ken Starr being one of them, Gates being another, that he was able to really suck in and convince somehow that he was going to be able to do something really important to them or to a cause that they believed in. Ken Starr, this was, Jeffrey Epstein was on the sort of the more liberal side of politics, but he was very shrewd. He knew that at the time that this case was happening, that it was a Republican administration in the White House. So who are you going to hire? When you're in trouble with the law and it's Republicans in the White House, you're going to hire Republican lawyers, and that is exactly what he did. He hired lawyers that he knew had connections that would help him. And Kenneth Starr was just one in a long line of lawyers that he hired to help him, and Kenneth Starr did, and we know this because it's in the documentation, it's in letters. There are letters in the file that Kenneth Starr wrote to friends of his in the Justice Department to try to get this case completely, make it completely disappear. And to the credit of the Justice Department at the time, they wouldn't let it disappear. But they didn't give him much of a sentence. I mean, they didn't let him completely off the hook, but they kept bouncing it back. And by bouncing it back to Palm Beach authorities, essentially, he got a sentence, but it was pretty cozy. If any of you recall, he was allowed to be in the Palm Beach County Jail in a separate wing. He was allowed to come and go to his beautiful office right here off the water here and stay there all day and have women come visit him all day. And it was a pretty cushy sentence, for 18 months. He really didn't stay much time in that jail itself. He was really in his office here in downtown West Palm.
Congratulations. This is such a timely discussion today, particularly into the Extract Media Center, because we have on the front pages 2 really important questions about journalism and the threat to journalism. One is the Fox Dominion litigation, and Murdoch admitting that his own reporters lied. And the other issue that's on the front pages, of course, is the issue of AI and chatbots, and the threat to honest reporting there. So could you comment on that subject, please?
Well, I haven't been following the chat box thing at all, I have to tell you. That one I haven't read. I have been following the Murdoch thing, the Murdoch story, of course, the Fox News story. I think what it shows us is that we in the media have to be more vigilant and responsible than ever before. That there is so much skepticism and even outright non-belief in journalism. Some people think all journalists are just bad people and everything that they report is wrong and that we're trying to help this side or that side. And really, nobody goes into journalism, really, no true journalist is like that. We go into journalism to get to the truth and to really be as fair as we can. Now, we're all human beings, we all have biases, but I think in general, we really try to test those biases almost every day and try to see the other side and try to report both sides. And so I think that case will be groundbreaking, because what Fox News has been trying to do, and also there's liberal media that do the same thing, that have been accused. And, as you know, when you turn on CNN or MSNBC, there are people on there, and all they're talking about is their opinions. They're not really journalists. They haven't investigated really exactly what happened. They're reading what they read on social media or in the newspaper, and then they're explaining, how they feel about it, but they're not really journalists. And I think that these cases will, set some kind of a precedent, I hope, for TV media and all media, really, to show that we need to be more vigilant in what we report and how we report it.
Michael, could you tell us a little bit about the frustration you felt when the local prosecutors chose not to do anything, and then how you were able to get the federal government involved to pick it up when they were ready to let it die?
Well, if you might remember, most of you were here, the state attorney here in Palm Beach County called a grand jury, which is very unusual to do that for a case like this. When the case was presented to the grand jury, there was an indictment that for soliciting a juvenile for prostitution, which labeled them as prostitutes. So as soon as that happened, by the way, and typically when that happens, the police department likes to arrest the person that has been indicted. Instead, he was allowed to turn himself into the county jail, and we in the Palm Beach Police Department learned of his arrest by opening the newspaper Monday morning and realizing that he turned himself into the county jail. So that day, Monday, we referred the case to the FBI and met with the assistant U.S. attorneys. And they basically said, this is an easy case. We get 10 years for every count. And we knew we had many, many different counts. Every instance where a child was abused by Epstein was an individual count. And the frustration, I knew that I was alone in this, and we were alone in this in the Palm Beach Police Department when I went to a meeting that's usually very well attended by all the police chiefs in Palm Beach County. And we sit at a big oval-shaped table, and that meeting happens, I think, once a month. And I looked around, I realized nobody was sitting next to me. And I thought, wow, there's nobody here at this? Well, they were standing against the wall, so they didn't have to sit next to me. Because unfortunately, it became, in the news media, the state attorney's word against mine. I thought that the case needed to have a full prosecution, and he did not. It was immediately picked up by the federal government, who initially acted responsibly, but then as time went on did not. And that was a difficult time, to be quite frank, for all of us in the Palm Beach Police Department, because we were the only ones saying that he needed to be prosecuted, and you had all of the country's best attorneys hired by Epstein, and he spent a huge amount of money doing all sorts of different things to discredit our case. And so, the good thing is, we have your families, you have each other. I had the elected officials in Palm Beach. I had the residents in Palm Beach that backed us up and said, we know that what you're doing is right. In the same way that you did when Julie first came to me, I said, Julie, why should I talk to you? Because I've talked to numerous other organizations where they put a lot of work into this and the stories were killed. And you said, talk to my editor, and I did. And the editor told me, I've been with the Palm Beach Post I've been with the Miami Herald for 26 years, and I want you to know that if they kill this story, because I said somebody from the board of McClatchy will make a call and this story will be killed. He said, if that happens, I will resign that day. So I looked into your eyes and I looked at his eyes and I believed him. And that's why we talked with you, and that's why you got the story that then got everything moving.
Hi, I'm Judy Miller, formerly an investigative reporter with the New York Times and still doing work. I want to, first of all, just say thank you. Thank you, Julie, for doing the work you did and for pointing out that a lot of it's not sexy and exciting. It's very boring. Often it's knocking on 100 doors and having 99 slammed in your face. or reading 100,000 words. And thank you for talking to her, Commissioner, because without you, it wouldn't have happened. And finally, thank you to Temple and Klein and now Extract for training journalists so that what you see on social media does not become what people think journalists are. I have 3 quick questions. One, Julie, what do you think of the Bill Barr report, which concluded that Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide and laid out the reasons for his conclusion? 2, in terms of bias and lying and why so many people don't believe us, Jeff Gerth has done an extraordinary series of articles, 4 of them in the Columbia Journalism Review, on the fraud that was the allegations that Donald Trump was shilling and an agent for Russia. They lay out in extraordinary detail how the press failed. No major newspaper has picked up on these extraordinary stories. Doesn't that hurt our credibility? 3, Julie, what's next? Thank you.
Wow, that was a long one. I have to be honest with you. I'm sort of on break right now. The case was a overwhelming one for myself, and I think that I buried a lot of the the trauma that really you go through when you are so entrenched in a story like this. It affected me, a couple of years later. I was so busy still trying to do the story and still trying to investigate where these records are, the grand jury records. There was all these lawsuits. We are still suing in New York, the Miami Herald, God bless them, really. This is something that the Herald hardly ever gets any credit on. We are still suing 4 years later for some of these records that were sealed in New York concerning one of the victims. And because, all these people keep objecting to them because their names, some of these are very wealthy people who have been named in this lawsuit as being involved with Jeffrey Epstein. And every time they object, of course, it takes months before the judge rules whether that name can be unsealed. And there are literally probably over 100 names of what they call John and Jane Does, who are named in these documents that most of them we know already have become public, like Prince Andrew and Bill Clinton, who was on Epstein's plane, and Trump, who was also on Epstein's plane. But this lawsuit still is winding its way through the courts, and it has cost the Herald and its parent company, McClatchy, I'm sure, probably almost $1 million at this point. So it still keeps going because these documents are still sealed. Journalism, I don't pretend to know the answers. I didn't get hired by the New York Times or the Washington Post, probably because I'm one of those reporters that do go after stories sometimes that are a little bit, this being an example of it, that a little bit, or they're very challenging. Again, I think a lot of, especially right now, a lot of media, they are trying to be so careful to not hurt one side or the other side that sometimes I think they end up not going after stories that they're worried will cause a lot of controversy. And some of the stories I think you mentioned are probably in that category that are going to cause them a lot of grief. And unfortunately, that is sort of the times that we're in right now. I hope that we turn a corner and journalism becomes stronger again so that we're able to do those kinds of things. But right now, I think that there's a lot of mainstream media that don't want to touch certain stories because they are so hard to investigate, time-consuming, costing so much money, and I think that has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, I got a couple of questions. One is, what was the attract? These guys were not going to that island because they wanted to see naked 14-year-old girls. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. I mean, these weren't just wackos. These were sort of everyone. I mean, what was the attraction? And the other thing is, where did Epstein get this whatever it was, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to keep supporting himself and paying people off? I mean, where'd the money come from this?
Well, The best way that I describe Jeffrey Epstein is similar to a cult leader. He really was almost a cult leader. I mean, he had the ability to just engage people. I mean, there were some very smart people who fell into his trap. I mean, we know of scientists at MIT, Harvard, academics who were, in his orbit and who didn't. I don't think that they attached themselves to him initially just because they wanted to have sex with 14-year-old girls. I mean, he was a very engaging, presented himself as a very worldly kind of person who had a lot of money and could donate. For one thing, he attached himself to scientists by donating millions and millions of money to their projects. That's how that started. And so there were other people that he found exactly. Let me just tell you a story, which I actually wish I had put in my book and I didn't. There's a lawyer who represented one of these victims who was molested by Epstein. And a number of lawyers represented these girls well after this happened, and they were suing him. And they used to have these little meetings, these civil lawyers who were suing Epstein. And Epstein found out who they were, and one by one he asked for meetings with them. Like, I just want to meet you, because he wanted to see what was in these lawyers' heads. And one of the lawyers had a love of a certain kind of cookie, chocolate chip cookie, that you could only get at a bakery in New York somewhere. So when that lawyer appeared to meet Jeffrey Epstein, he had a whole tray of those cookies right in front of him. I mean, he just hired, as the chief said, he had people go through your trash. He interviewed your freaking elementary school teacher. He had to know everything about someone that he was going to meet with, or that he considered an opponent, or that he wanted to woo for money, for power, for, anything that he really, I think he really considered it a game, like a chess game.
Julie,
Where?
Julie, if you did that series for the New York Times, you would have won a Pulitzer Prize. You richly deserved it. And I was startled you didn't get it.
Thank you.
When you started this, it was a dead story, and I'd like to know why the editors allowed you to do this, something that could have gone nowhere. And secondly, what if somebody went into your newsroom now with the same kind of story? Does the paper still have the resources to let somebody do that?
Those are really good questions. First of all, the New York Times knew about this story. The same lawyers that really wanted to make this public, what they had found out over the years. There was a lot of information after he was initially put in Palm Beach County Jail, served his 18 months, got out, went back to his jet-setting life, and probably molesting more girls. There were all these lawsuits, as I mentioned, and all these civil cases, and they were getting more and more new information about more victims and more corrupt politicians that he had in his pocket, so to speak, how he manipulated the prosecutors. So they knew all about this as they pieced together these civil lawsuits. And they went to the New York Times and they told them, this is really a big story. And what I was told from one of the lawyers was that the New York Times said it's a lawsuit story. It's not when the lawsuit gets tried, we'll cover it. They didn't really realize that this was not just a court story; it was really a big story. So they had that story, and I'm sure that they kicked themselves. I know that they kicked themselves after our story appeared. As I said before, everything that I did in my career prepared me for this story. It would, you asked if this would happen again, would the Herald have the resources? It's not even just the resources as far as data and being able to sue and all that. You have to have the right reporters, and unfortunately, we're very, very thin-staffed now. All newspapers, Palm Beach Post included, we're very thin-staffed, and I had the experience to do it. I don't think that there would have been a lot of other reporters on the staff who would have been able to do this story. I'm not just saying that, I'm saying that because it was really, I think that the Herald permitted me to do it because they knew I would be able to do it. because I had done so much other work, and they knew I was pretty relentless. They knew I was very careful. So you have to have a reporter with experience, and unfortunately, that isn't happening. A lot of they're hiring younger reporters. The older ones or the veterans are retiring, or also for local newspapers, they're moving to bigger papers where they can make more money. The Miami Herald, a lot of the reporters go to the Washington Post, and Washington Post is sort of lovingly referred to as Miami Herald North, because all the reporters end up going, a lot of them, to the Washington Post. So the answer is, you're going to see fewer of these kinds of stories coming out of local news unless something changes, because we're now, the Miami Herald, for example, is owned by a hedge fund essentially, and they just want to see the dollars. They don't necessarily invest in the kind of work that investigative reporters do, as David said, because it costs so much time and money.
Getting back to Jeffrey here, is this working?
Yeah.
The word you haven't used, hasn't been used much, that I think plays a major role in all this, is blackmail. People ask how we got all his money. I believe a fair amount of that came from blackmail in his relationships, and I think that had a lot to do with the cover-up also. So I don't know if that comes up in your book, but I think that was one of his major tools that got him the power that he got.
Right. Well, when you know the most intimate and damaging information about someone, and certainly then you need something from that person, sometimes you don't have to actually say, if you don't do this, I'll do that. You don't need to do that. If that person knows, where your skeletons lie.
If you got pictures, you got a good weapon.
Right. Right. Yeah. That's true.
I guess I got several. This is fascinating. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Just a quick follow-through to Larry's question. Do you go into it all, the relationship that Epstein had with Wexner and what the blackmail may have been there? Because a lot of us in this room know him, and as a result of what happened, his reputation has really been totally destroyed. I mean, he's no longer the chairman or chief executive of his company. His family is an array, and so on. So could you talk a little bit about that? The other part of my question is, the person over there Judy spoke a little bit about Bill Maher, but as your follow-through, why wouldn't you pick up the pieces and really do another breathtaking story on what caused Epstein's death, and pull together the court papers and the autopsy reports that you were able to get to do the story that you did?
Well, the autopsy isn't public, as I mentioned. The coroner in New York hasn't released it. The family hasn't released it for whatever reason, even though they don't believe that he committed suicide either. I mean, I'd love to investigate his death, but it happened in New York. I'm a reporter down here. My paper really at some point had to say, we need you here in Miami. You can't be investigating a case in New York. I mean, that is the nature of, I kind of pushed the envelope with taking on this case to begin with, because the Miami Herald has, as I mentioned, we've gotten smaller and smaller. We don't even really cover Broward County that much anymore. We're really based in Miami, and we barely have reporters to cover stories that happen in Miami. So I really pushed the envelope covering a story in Palm Beach to begin with, which had ties in New York. So at some point they were inevitably going to say, look, we just can't spare you to stay on this story forever. And basically that's what happened.
What about Wexner?
Well, Wexner was sort of a corollary character in the story, because remember, my story was based here in Palm Beach on what he did here in Palm Beach with the high school girls, unfortunately, here. Wexner, of course, was sort of one of those corollary figures who he was more connected with through Ohio and the work he did in Ohio and somewhat in New York. So again, it was sort of one of those, I could have reported this. I could have jumped through so many rabbit holes with this story, but at some point, You have to have four corners to it, and you got to put something down on paper, and you got to publish it. And so at some point, we sort of had to say, this is what we can do now, and decide later whether we want to do follow-ups.
And in your commitment, in your opinion, how could you control social media from creating a lot of the havoc we have in this country, including politics and everything else that goes on?
You can. You can't control social media. Cat's already out of the box. It's all there. I just think you have to be better consumers of what you read, you know, and pay attention to the source. I always tell people when they say something, you know, did you hear about this? And I know it's kind of like, you know, fake news. But so I'll say, well, where did you read it? Well, I don't know where I read it. I said, well, tell me where you read it, then come back to me and tell me that it's news. Because you would be surprised at how many smart people that I know who say things that they read that are so total BS. And I have to kind of call them on and say, I don't know where you read that, but that's not true.
So I would add one thing. I mean, there is something in the courts right now, a legal debate about something called Section 230 that protects the platforms and protects a lot of electronic transmission from lawsuits. And that could be altered or even thrown out at some point, and that may have, you know, I think journalists are torn on it. I don't like anything that opens the door to more libel suits or defamation suits, but that possibly, I think it could have some mitigating factors. I think that law as it's written is too broad and creates a lot of this havoc.
Thank you to all the speakers today. I just have a very general question, which you were just touching on with social media. What advice would you have for us for discerning the truth of media? How do we figure it out? What do you consult, or what would you advise us to consult as the readers and consumers of media when we can't access these public documents and other things?
Well, I'll tell you what I do. When I see something, it sounds, oh my gosh, you know, Brett Favre allegedly took all this money that was supposed to go to poor people in Mississippi, and he used it to build a big volleyball stadium at his daughter's college. So you see something like that, for example, on social media. So I'm thinking, wow, that's really crazy. So I actually go to the Mississippi newspaper, the local newspaper, and see that they had been covering that story for months before it broke. They had been getting the records. They had been doing all the really great investigative steps to show that, in fact, they got even text messages that he had exchanged with some of the public officials showing that he knew that he shouldn't have been using that money to build a stadium. You know, the answer is you really need to look at the local newspaper where it happened. You need to either see if there was a story in the New York Times, you Google it, you know, I just think you need to be, as I said, really good consumers of news and pay attention to what you're reading. And don't believe anything really on social media without triple checking it.
Can you talk a little bit about where you see journalism going over the next few years, especially in view of the fact that there are less and less talented reporters around?
Well, there are less veteran reporters around, but I don't think that there's ever been such an appetite for young people going into the news business. I'm really, you know, happy about the fact that I meet so many young people that are willing to take on this as a career, because it is a really tough career. And you don't make a lot of money in it. And David probably can answer this question better than I. But there's a lot of...
Yeah, I'll take a run at it. I'm actually really optimistic about where we're going in journalism. We're in a state of really painful transition now. But, you know, most of us, probably all of us in this room, we grew up in a world where the news was, you know, Walter Cronkite saying, and that's the way it is. You know, in retrospect, we come to know that that wasn't actually the way it was all the time. I mean, that was one perspective. It was news that was very much in many ways filtered and sanitized, and yeah, and not that Walter Cronkite wasn't a great journalist. I think he was, but it was very much from a particular paradigm of our and segment of our society. We're seeing now, particularly with the disruption of news as an industry and this advertising-based model, we're seeing all kinds of news sites that are legitimate journalism sites emerging. We're seeing a lot of nonprofit journalism that is going to be supported by philanthropy and by subscription rather than by advertising. And with that, and there's a great example of it actually in Philadelphia right now. There was a gentleman named Jerry Lenfest who was a great philanthropist in the city of Philadelphia. And Jerry was the publisher and owner of the Philadelphia Inquirer in his last years. And he created a nonprofit that's now known as the Lenfest Institute for Journalism. I happen to be the founding chair of that nonprofit. And he donated the newspaper to the nonprofit. And Jerry's idea was, communities need to start thinking of news in the same way they think of libraries and museums and public schools, and they need to support it because it's such an essential aspect of community health. So I think we're, again, very painful transition now, and we're seeing all the ugliness of this transition, but I really believe 10 years from now, we're going to have a much more healthy and reliable news ecosystem.
Can I ask one other question of the commissioner, which changes the subject a little bit, since we're all here in Palm Beach, and even though you're no longer the commissioner, can you talk a little bit about where you see the crime going? Because we got another alert saying lock your car and don't leave your keys in it. We've had this problem with anti-Semitism and ticketing. Do you have any advice you can give all of us? Because it's a totally relevant subject that we're all concerned about.
Just briefly, I have a security and private investigative firm, and I've had that since I retired from the police department, so I'm still engaged with all of that. And, I'm also on the town's strategic planning board, and we're about to complete our mission. And we don't really even know how many people are in Palm Beach. We just know there are more than there's ever been before. I've been here 42 years, and some of you longer. The police department has cameras at all the entrances to the town, and they can count the number of vehicles. On average, we have about 75,000 incoming vehicle trips into the town a day. Could be 4 people in that vehicle, could be 1 person, and that doesn't count your cars that don't leave the island. So along with that dramatic increase in the service population, we become a bigger target for people that would do us some harm. So the days of not locking your car and leaving your keys in your car or not locking your front door, they're gone. They're gone everywhere in America. So we're in the process of defining the size of the problem now. Part of the problem is there are so many people here who, we've had a huge number of people moved here from California and New York in the last 2 years. Well, if you look at Palm Beach compared to those places, it looks very safe. But the reality is, I used to say when I was police chief, 1 purse off of Worth Avenue probably equals 30 at the Palm Beach Outlet Mall. So, there are increases in crime. I don't think, frankly, that the government's right-sized here. Our service population is probably about 75,000 or more people at a time. We're set up for the 9,000 people that the census says we have. So you should not think that anywhere in this area is completely safe and you can suspend all of that. I did a little presentation a few weeks ago to the Civic Association, and I showed the homicide map of Palm Beach County. We haven't had a homicide in Palm Beach, the town of Palm Beach, since 2009 when they built the map. But if you look at the surrounding areas, if you live on Flagler Drive, it's astounding and it's frightening. So is this Miami? It's nowhere near Miami. But it's also not Jupiter Island either. So you need to know when you have a community with many great restaurants and all the activity that we have and so many interesting people, you're going to have crime too. And it's gone up, but it's still the safest place in South Florida, short of very small communities that are bedroom communities.
hope you really enjoyed this. I certainly did. And this is what the Institute is trying to do, is bring these subjects that you won't hear most places, you know, it's not something that's there. But anyway, please look on our website. It's couderinstitute.org. You're invited to come and join us. We're having one on Thursday with a famous, wonderful photographer, Priscilla Rattazzi. Her family is from a very prominent Italian family. She's a wonderful photographer. The week after that, we're having a friend of Richard Extracts, who is not only a psychoanalyst, but he's one of the great teachers at NYU about art. And he's going to talk about how you're collecting, but also about who he thinks are the new up-and-coming artists. So we really have a good one. And then the last one, I think, I might be skipping over someone, is the Naval War College. And I can promise you, you want to hear this, because she's Chinese, and she's going to talk to you about how they're planning if there's a war with China and how they're going to deal with it. So I think you should hopefully, yes, what?
I just want to say to this group that since I'm the person that's probably known Dale since she was 19 years old, I'm not sure there's anybody else here that's done it, is that she's just been doing a marvelous job with this, and I just want to express how great she's doing.
That's so nice. Thank you. And thank you for all of you who are contributing, and my board members and the Schwartz. I mean, just thank you very much, because we can't do it unless we get donations, and every cent really goes to the event. I take nothing. I mean, and we have to pay Debbie and somebody, but I tell you, it's all a labor of love. It's not a money-making proposition. And it's a 501c3, so pass it along. Thank you.